Thanks for coming out. It's cool to see a lot of people here. And we have about a dozen people joining on Zoom as well. If you have questions or comments, I guess enter them into the chat. But thank you for joining as well, Zoom people. We have some food, etc. All right, let's get started. Thanks for coming to this talk. This is the last in our P30 series for the semester before we really get our summers going. I'm really thrilled to introduce our speaker, Robert Pollin. He's the Distinguished University Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts-Amherst. But he's also no stranger to New York City. He received, I think, his PhD at the New School, where, among other things, he took classes from luminaries like the Marxist economist and publisher Paul Sweezy. And then now at UMass, he directs PERI, P-E-R-I, the Political Economy Research Institute, which publishes just a real variety of research on everything from what we'll hear about today, climate change, environmental justice, to other problems in our society, our healthcare system, our financial regulatory regime, and other things. I'm also really pleased to have him speaking here at the Public Health School because I think we try to marry a few values, research that is of serious and rigorous empirical quality, that isn't just navel-gazing stuff that sits on a shelf, and social justice ideals. And I don't know many people who do all three of those things as well, but Dr. Pollin is certainly one of those people. Finally, on a personal note, I first heard about Pollin when I was a teenager. I grew up in Los Angeles, and it was before this idea of a $15 an hour living wage had any currency. It was like 20 years ago. And with Stephanie Luce, Pollin was the person a lot of people turned to when they needed evidence that the idea of a living wage was actually a workable thing. And then later during the Obama administration, he became a leading voice around the idea of green jobs and the creation of a just transition away from dirty fossil fuels to renewable energy. And so it's not a surprise to me that Dr. Pollin is a co-author on a new book with some obscure academic named Noam Chomsky entitled Climate Crisis and the Global Green New Deal. And he'll share some of that today. I think the Green New Deal framework is one that's been embraced by a lot of younger people, but I think less so by people in our orbits. And I think it's something we should be talking about more. Finally, this is not the first time Dr. Pollin and I have crossed paths. When I was a graduate student in Philadelphia, I had to write this paper. We all had to write these papers, and I had to review and assess 4 books. And one of them was this book that he had written called Contours of Dissent. And it was about the 1990s and how the 1990s wasn't actually so fabulous economically for everybody, even if stock market indices and other kinds of aggregate indicators seem to suggest that. So as I wrote this paper, and I actually really got into it, like a lot of those papers were teeth pulls, but this was one I really got into. Paper ended up being 120 pages. And my professor read this 120-page paper and turns to me and goes, you know, Merlin, this is actually pretty insightful. You should send it to the people whose books you reviewed. And so I sent it to Dr. Pollin, and like 2 days later, he'd read the whole thing. And I knew he'd read the whole thing because he caught some of the little jokes that I inserted on like page 58. And he gave me some really detailed advice on how to make it better. And then he put it up on PERI, his organization's working paper series. And you know, as a miserable graduate student in Philadelphia, where you're lonely, you wonder if anything you write is ever going to get taken seriously, that meant the world to me. And I've always remembered that kindness and that gesture when younger people come up to me. And I wish I could more consistently show the grace and the generosity that you did towards me. And I will always remember that. So Please join me in welcoming a brilliant scholar and a very nice guy, Robert Pollin.
Well, there's no way I can live up to that introduction. Sorry. You've already heard the best. Okay, good. So I should just also acknowledge, as long as we're just starting off. I have a good, strong, very strong connection with Columbia University. That is, my wife went to Columbia, and we got 30 years later, my daughter went to Columbia, and my daughter was just texting me, like, if you heard the ding, because she wanted to talk to me about something. And I said, I can't, I'm at Columbia right now. So anyway, I lived, when I was at the New School, my wife was at Columbia. We lived in Columbia housing at 115th and Morningside. I know the neighborhood very well. I actually met my wife at St. Luke's Hospital on 114. Anyway, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm happy to be here. Yeah, and it does help to write a book with some obscure nobody. Yeah, and it was just a pure coincidence. And somehow the sales of that book compared to the sales of all of my previous books combined, and about 10 times more. And I'm sure it's a total coincidence. Anyway, and the title of this talk is exactly the title of the book that I did with Noam Chomsky called Climate Crisis in the Global Green New Deal. And I think we negotiated the title. That's anyway, that's where we are. So I'm not going to just talk about stuff in the book. I mean, I go beyond and try to very much bring it up to the moment. So okay, and I guess I don't know what the format is, but if anybody wants to ask questions or raise points at any time, that's fine. Okay, so what is the Green New Deal? I've actually had a good time talking to a few of you today, and the name AOC comes up. I think she's doing a lot of good things. I'm not going to talk about her resolution about the Green New Deal. Because it's a political document, and I'm not against it, but it's not what it's not focused in the way that I'm hoping the research is going to be. So just to define what I mean when I say Green New Deal, as you can see, the purpose to combine, create democratic and egalitarian societies that are also ecologically sustainable. And so the question is how to do that in the context of the climate crisis. So we have to solve the climate crisis, as I'll get to more in a bit, but you all know that anyway. We have to solve it within our present institutional environment, which means it has to be solved within capitalism, whether we like it or not, because we're not going to have a different economic system within the next 20 years, whether we like it or not. So the Green New Deal then is a way through which, in my view, we can advance a program for climate stabilization that will also be an egalitarian program, and therefore will be transformative in terms of broader set of social and economic issues. And just to cite one example that was just accomplished this month in New York State, I don't know if all of you have heard about the Build Public Renewables Act that just passed this week, literally this month, which requires all state and municipal properties, New York State, to consume 100% renewables, state by 2030, municipalities by 2035. All the electricity has to come from renewables. And the critical thing is, if the privately owned utilities are not getting to the level of supply required to achieve that, then the law enables public utilities to take over and expand their capacity to meet it. So that's a major victory, and it's very much in the spirit of Green New Deal as I understand it. Okay, just briefly, we don't have a lot of time, but just to give you a sense of when I say there is an ecological crisis, right? We know that. Just some examples. The most striking, certainly, as an individual instance, being this what happened last year in India and Pakistan. Average daily temperature is 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Monsoon flooding in Pakistan inundated 9% of the country's land area. Obviously, this is unsustainable, and if we continue along our present trajectory, it's just going to get worse, a lot worse. Here's just a quote from a Washington Post piece on India's daily deadly heat wave. And again, what they're saying is, as conditions once experienced only in saunas and deep mine shafts are rapidly becoming an open air reality for hundreds of millions of people. That's where we are. Okay, so to formalize this a bit more, I want to look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's assessment reports that they rolled out basically starting at the end of 2021. Two big huge 6,000 pages in February and April 2022, and then the final overall 6 assessment report, which came out 2 months ago in March 2023. And they're again a very unsurprising result, but the level of the intensity of their alarm has only increased over the last few years. Human-induced climate change is causing dangerous and widespread disruption in nature and affecting the lives of billions of people around the world, despite efforts to reduce the risk. People and ecosystems least able to cope are being the hardest hit. This is what the chair of the IPCC said about it. I'm not going to read it. Okay. The IPCC, as you all probably know, is the most authoritative mainstream institution addressing climate change, basically the science around climate change, and then some on solutions. And so what they basically established in 2018 in a preliminary version of the 6 assessment reports that has come out in the last year and a half, is that they set a target of climate stabilization at 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Their previous target had been 2 degrees, and that they realized through the latest rounds of research that they really have to stabilize at 1.5 and not 2. And failure to do so is only going to intensify these impacts that we're already seeing, for example, over the last year in India and Pakistan. Okay, now how do you get to the 1.5 degree stabilization point? They also have a program, not all that fleshed out, but it's there. And they say that we have to cut CO2 emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, by 50% as of 2030. 2030 is only 6.5 years from now. And we have to be at net zero emissions by 2050. So that's the program. And we can say it's unrealistic, it can never be done, but a very excellent coalition of groups called the U.S. Green New Deal Network, which is a lot of NGOs and, for example, the Sierra Club, some of the big ones, smaller ones. Working Families Party of New York is part of it. The Green New Deal Network they developed this thing called the Thrive Agenda, and I don't know what the acronym exactly stands for anymore. But it was for the US, and it very much, in my view, captured you know, a viable program for getting to this IPCC set of goals for the US economy. The Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, that was actually is law, it was passed in 2022, gets you about 20% of the way that the Thrive program, by the way, the Thrive program was endorsed by 100 members of Congress, including Chuck Schumer, including Elizabeth Warren, and of course AOC and so forth. So the Inflation Reduction Act has some real positive features. We can talk about it if you want. I'm not going to focus on it per se. So, for example, building rural electricity co-ops, it's happening thanks to the money available through the IRA. It's also true, if you've been following the debates around the debt ceiling now, that one of the demands of the Republicans is basically to gut the Inflation Reduction. In fact, that is the #1 thing on which they're focused. They don't want to have any green energy investments. And if they can't get that right now, they're saying, oh, then okay, we'll just crash the global economy as something that, you know, we absolutely have to do if you're not going to give in on gutting the Inflation Reduction Act. So these issues are very much alive and at this dead center of policy debates going on at this very moment. I'll come back to that. Okay, Chev, then just to give a little broader framework on where we are. Yeah, so this shows us the global mean temperature relative to the pre-industrial level. So, you know, I guess the pointer, is there a pointer that works?
Yeah.
Which one is it? This one?
It's this one.
Okay, good. Thanks. So, what happened to it? Oh, yeah. Oh, I guess you need me to stay here. The owl. All right, I will work. Okay, good. So, this is, you know, this is temperature anomaly. So this is the pre-industrial level 0.0. And here we are. This is showing us the movement. And basically what we're at is, you know, up to 1920 or so, we were below this average. And now you see the trajectory and the real increase in the global mean temperature, no, really only starts around 1980. So we've known about the science of climate change for 150 years, but you know, in terms of generating dangerous levels of temperature anomalies, this is very much a phenomenon of the last 40 years, which happens to coincide with the emergence of neoliberalism, global neoliberalism, which, by the way, thank you, Merlin, referencing my book that you reviewed so well, Contours of Dissent. It was about neoliberalism and the emergence of neoliberalism, but I didn't have anything about this in the book. We can see that that is something that is really a feature of our contemporary prevailing economic ideology of neoliberal capitalism. Now, this is maybe the most frightening. I'm going to switch pointers because I brought my own. It works better. There we go. Okay, so these are projections from the International Energy Agency, the IEA, which again is a thoroughly mainstream organization created initially by the private oil company. And this shows us projections for emissions. And remember, we're saying we have to get a 50% cut by 2030 and 0 by 2050. And this is from them. This is not my model. And so they have other categories, so I'll focus on the stated government policy. So this says, according to their model, if all the governments do what they're saying they're going to do, here's what happens to emissions between now and 2050. We're at 36 billion tons of CO2 emissions now. 2030 will be at 36 billion tons, so no cut whatsoever. And by 2050, we're at 34. So if you believe climate change, the science of climate change as represented by the IPCC, and if you say take this model seriously, maybe it's not right, but it's the International Energy Agency. I think at least we should take it seriously. But what's our interpretation? If governments do what they say they're going to do between now and 2050, basically we're doomed. That's what it's saying. Okay. Yeah, sure.
I was just wondering, how much of their original vision of the inflation reduction was, like you said, 20% was PRI, but was it like near 100% the original vision of the inflation reduction?
What relative to Thrive?
Yeah, the original.
Okay, so you have the Thrive was created by these, basically these relatively progressive groups in DC, the Green New Deal Network. That got translated into Build Back Better, which was introduced by the Biden administration. Build Back Better, I would say, gets you about 40% of where, like I said, it was better. We're building back better than the Inflation Reduction Act. Inflation Reduction Act, well, one of the things that is controversial, and why the Republicans are saying we have to get rid of it, is that the Inflation Reduction Act does have various incentive programs, such as for electric vehicles. The actual level of spending is uncapped. The actual level of spending only depends on, how many people are going to buy electric vehicles, and you get your whatever it is, how much of a subsidy, like a 30% subsidy. And I think in the model, the level of estimate as to how many people are going to take this up turned out to be a lot less than people are willing to do. And so I think the Republicans and the oil companies and the utilities, this is why they are so focused on gutting the Inflation Reduction Act, because there's all these uncapped subsidies, which could be much bigger. And from my point of view, good. Let's use them. So, but this, it's true. I don't think this includes it was not. It was this model was before the Inflation Reduction Act. This is global emissions, by the way. Okay, so yeah, we're doomed. If governments do it, just if they do everything they say they do, going to do. And now announced pledges is not just saying what they're going to do, but the pledges that they've put in at the Paris Agreement, the 2015 Paris Climate Conference, which is in excess of what their stated positions are. Even that, basically no change by 2030, and by 2050 we're still at 21 billion tons of CO2 emissions. Effectively, by either of these scenarios, what do we want to do? Oh, sorry. Should I carry this microphone around? Is that easier? Is that easier?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll do it. Well, I mean, if you go to the International Renewable Energy Agency models, this stuff is on, page 537. And what I'm telling you, narrating the results of it it's not in the study, it's just me telling you. But there it is. And this is what they're saying. I mean, they do have, to their credit, they now do have a net zero. They do have a scenario, which you can do, and I do one. I do a global one, but basically we're saying, these are the realistic ones. This is where politics is, at present. Which is frightening, let's say. Okay, now, what is a Green New Deal that actually can get us to a viable climate stabilization path? So that's what we're going to talk about. So the first thing that it has to include is phase out of fossil fuel consumption, because fossil fuel consumption is responsible for 75% of emissions. So whatever else you do, you're not going to solve climate change as long as we keep consuming fossil fuels, pretty much at all. But basically, certainly at anywhere close to the magnitude that we are at present. There's no way to avoid that solution. There are people that say there is a way. I'll get to that. If we're going to phase out the fossil fuel industry, then we have to include a transition program for people that work in the fossil fuel industry and for the communities that are dependent. And that has to be front and center, right there, along with the phasing out of the industry. We are still going to want to consume energy, obviously. For example, to make this microphone work. And that therefore, the next step is to come up with alternative energy sources. And so we need to build a green energy global infrastructure. And according to my own model, which actually ends up coinciding with other people's models, we're looking at something like a 2.5% of global GDP every year. I can go through the details of that as you wish. That includes public and private investment. So 75% of emissions is from burning fossil fuels to produce energy. The other 25% comes from deforestation and industrial agriculture. So we need to phase out deforestation and industrial agriculture and substitute afforestation and organic agricultural practices. I'm going to focus on the energy transition now. Okay, now if we do a Green New Deal as I just described it, it will have these co-benefits. A big one, a major one, as I've talked about and will talk about, is job creation. Because if you spend 2.5% of GDP on anything, you're going to get jobs. And so the question is how many jobs? And a lot is the answer. Roughly speaking, you're going to get about 2.5% to 3% of your workforce if you're going to spend 2.5% to 3% of your GDP on any activity. I mean, it's going to be a little bit off depending on levels of labor intensity, but basically that's it. It is also a really viable answer to austerity politics. If you followed, for example, the election in Greece just a few days ago, Greece has been operating effectively under conditions of austerity since 2009. And the Green New Deal for Greece, actually, I'm drafting something for them right now, is a way to say we bust out of austerity, we create jobs, and we address the climate crisis. Those of you who know way more than me about public health, the public health benefits of not burning fossil fuels and not polluting are, yes, we have experts in the room, and I won't embarrass myself by talking way above my level of knowledge here. Another part of the story is, as I'll show briefly, is actually green energy is cheaper than fossil fuel energy. It's cheaper than nuclear energy too. So lower cost energy and at opportunities at smaller scale production levels means that you can move alternative energy systems more easily into low income regions, rural regions. And we know that something like 30% of rural regions in developing countries don't have any access to electricity, even now. Which then will create more opportunities for alternative ownership forms. including in New York, which just happened, as I mentioned, the opportunity to expand public ownership of utilities based on the law that just passed earlier this month. Okay, so and then what about getting rid of capitalism? Is this all due to capitalism? And do we have to get rid of capitalism? We're not going to. So we have to deal with that and figure out how to operate within the framework of capitalism. Now, it is true that burning fossil fuels to produce energy is the major source of climate change. And it is true, in my opinion, the greatest obstacle to stop burning fossil fuels to produce energy is the gigantic profits that oil companies make. And they're not about to give it up without a fight. So for the example, the last year, the 6 major private global oil companies earned $200 billion, all-time record. So that much is true. On the other hand, 90% of the fossil fuel assets in the world today is owned by public companies. So to say it's private capitalism is the problem ignores 90% of ownership, which is public. So to say we transition, like, okay, in New York State, talking about transitioning to public ownership of utility, it's good. But to just say we're going to transition to public ownership of energy companies means if that's the solution, we're pretty much 90% there already, because 90% of these companies are publicly owned. And yes, I'm talking about Russia, Saudi Arabia, China, Iran, but yeah, Brazil, Venezuela. These are publicly owned companies. They own 90% of fossil fuel assets. So I think we have to be careful when we say public ownership, nationalization can be part of the solution, but it is not the solution in and of itself. It may give you an opportunity, as in the case now with the New York State Build Public Renewable Act, it gives you the opportunity to introduce green energy more aggressively than might be the case, or let's say that will be the case under private ownership, but it is definitely no guarantee that you're solving a climate crisis by moving into public ownership or depending on public ownership. So I can go into a lot of detail on how to do a energy transformation, but just to give you a flavor of it, and if you want to talk about it, you know, ask questions or whatever, but for now, just to give a small flavor. So when we talk about stop burning fossil fuels, it's really a completely viable, a completely doable goal. It's not pie in the sky. Well, let me just tell you how. As I said, burning fossil fuels to produce energy is responsible for 75% of all CO2 emissions. And if we say we're going to eliminate it altogether in 30 years, well, actually 26 years to get to 2030, just some simple math. Total consumption, energy consumption globally measured in British thermal units, BTUs. We can talk about quadrillion BTUs or quads or QBTUs. Right now, the latest data, we're at about 485 quadrillion BTUs. So how do we get to zero? We just cut, you know, just divide 485 by 30. That means you have to cut 18 quadrillion BTUs a year. And you figure out what, you know, what you're going to consume. You're either going to consume less, you're going to be more efficient, or you're going to substitute in green energy. But you cut 18 quadrillion BTUs per year. And so I have for 27, yeah, I divided by 27, not 30, because we're to 2023. So that means a little bit less than 4% cut per year. Absolute cut relative to current levels. Every year when you cut, your base is going to get smaller. So percentage wise, it gets bigger, and that makes the problem look more daunting. But relative to current levels of consumption, it's a 4% cut, which is achievable, easily achievable. I mean, during COVID, when we had a global lockdown, we had about a 6% cut in energy consumption. And so we can do that, and if we're substituting in alternative energy at the same time, this becomes a viable path. And so, yes, we do need to build the alternatives at the same time, and that requires energy efficiency investments in all areas of energy consumption. So buildings, for example, high energy buildings, transportation systems, meaning public transportations, electric vehicles, high efficiency vehicles, industrial production. And then the energy efficiency is by far the cheapest way to reduce emissions, but there's only so much you can squeeze, and therefore we have to build an alternative energy system whose foundation is renewables, solar, wind primarily, but also geothermal, small scale hydro, and some bioenergy. And according to, again, my own calculations, as a share of GDP moving forward in the global economy, it's about 2.5% of GDP per year. And today's global economy, that's about $2.5 trillion today. By 2050, it'll be about $4.5 trillion. I'm sorry. On average, between now and 2050, it's about $4.5 trillion. That's 2.5%. It's a lot of money, but it's 2.5% of GDP in a growing economy. And that means that 97.5% of all economic activity can be on other things. The level of green energy investments right now is about 0.5% of GDP. So we need to increase that fivefold as a share of GDP. And the Inflation Reduction Act is pushing in the right direction. In Europe, the European Green Deal is pushing in the right direction. They're just not aggressive enough, and they have to become more aggressive. So here's some of the co-benefits. Clean energy is cheap. What are we looking at? We're looking at these kind of light brown, gray rectangles are showing us the range of costs for fossil fuel energy to generate electricity. And that's, these are in US cents, so that's 20 cents, that's 10 cents. So that's our range for fossil fuel energy, but just looking at onshore wind now and solar PV. And here we are in 2020 versus 2010. These red and blue dots are actually individual site observations, and the lines are trend lines. And this basic story that you can see is that onshore wind is way down at the low level relative to fossil fuel energy. So it's 8 cents to 6 cents. Solar is the big story, having dramatically declined by over 80% since 2010, such that solar is now in the range of cheapest energy source for supplying electricity. Now, I haven't mentioned nuclear energy and carbon capture technology as part of the green transition. So now I will give you my position on that. Energy efficiency is by far the cheapest. So even relative to the low cost renewables, it's to supply enough energy efficiency, like to retrofit this building. I don't know how efficient it's an old building. It's probably not very efficient. Is about 15% per unit of reduced energy consumption relative to building renewable capacity. So it's by far the cheapest, and you want to push that as far as you can. That said, renewables, as I just showed, is cheaper than nuclear. and carbon capture. This is from the US Energy Department. So again, not exactly, Greenpeace or somebody. Here's their figure for coal with carbon capture by 2026, 7.3 cents per kilowatt hour. Nuclear 6.9, solar PV 3.3, onshore wind 3.7, geothermal 3.6 cents. It's half the cost, unsubsidized. At least, according to the US Energy Department. And these numbers were the same under Trump, by the way. So the US Energy Department has been saying this for years. The International Renewable Energy Agency, basically the same story. They reported in June 2021 that 62% of newly installed renewables was cheaper than the cheapest fossil fuel alternative. So that's where we are. Renewable energy and efficiency are cheaper. Again, let's say you don't care about saving the planet, it's still the cheapest alternative in building out the new energy infrastructure. What about, nuclear and carbon capture? So we just saw nuclear is it's twice the price. And if we were pro-nuclear before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's pretty hard, in my opinion, to sustain it, given what we saw, that Russia immediately used the nuclear power plants as a weapon. They seized control of Chernobyl in February 2022, and then the largest nuclear plant in Europe, Zaporizhzhia, I'm probably not pronouncing it right. And then they used it as a threat. Okay, we can blow this up anytime we want. It didn't, but it only takes one time. And if you have like what the nuclear proponents, the most prominent being James Hansen, who is a great climate scientist, he's arguing for tenfold increase in nuclear capacity. In a tenfold increase in nuclear capacity, do we really know that we are going to have adequate regulations and protection for every single one of those sites, especially given what we see in the last year in Ukraine? My answer is no. So that we don't need to go that route. The second, carbon capture, meaning you keep burning the fossil fuels, but we have technologies to absorb the carbon, and therefore we don't face the climate consequences. And that's when you hear the term net zero, the net part is, okay, we still can have positive emissions, but we absorb them. And how do we absorb them? That's carbon capture. To date, there's one technology that works, planting trees. And yeah, very high-tech solution. Planting trees does absorb CO2, and therefore deforestation is part of the problem with climate, because we are doing the opposite of planting trees. But even an aggressive program for afforestation is only going to get us maybe maximally to 10% of the level of carbon reduction. That's maximum. The alternative high-tech carbon capture technologies, the oil companies love it. And in fact, the next COP, the climate conference is scheduled for this year in November in the United Arab Republic. And surprise, surprise, they want to focus on carbon capture, developing carbon capture technology. To date, there's no evidence that this can work at scale, any of the technologies that they have. And this is from the IPCC itself, which is not anti-carbon capture, but they're just saying that the deployment is, quote, far below what is needed, and that implementation, we don't know when it's going to work. And if we have to get to zero, and net zero in 2050, the net part, we cannot depend on these technologies. That's why, you know, the core of the solution, in my view, has to be energy efficiency, renewable, just transition for the communities. So briefly, in terms of job creation, these are just some figures from some various research studies I've done, and I won't go through the whole thing, but the last column here is just showing one of the things we did in different countries is said, okay, let's just look at the infrastructure within the countries and what is the level of job creation that results through building out green energy versus fossil fuel energy. And the last column here is showing you get between 2 to 3 times more jobs basically per dollar of expenditure. And the reason you get 2 to 3 times more jobs is not because they're green and virtuous, it's they're more labor intensive. That's just it. I mean, we would probably be for these green investments, even if they weren't more labor intensive, but they are. So let's seize that as a way to expand job opportunities. And then in terms of just transition, because actually these calculations I think are useful in part, but they don't capture what we're really talking about with the Green New Deal. What we're really talking about with the Green New Deal is not, are we going to build out green energy or are we going to build out fossil fuel energy? What we're really talking about is, yes, building out green energy and phasing down fossil fuel energy. And so that what we really need to compare is not so much those percentages, though useful, but the process of building out the green and how do we then, what's the impact of phasing out the fossil fuel energy. And so that's what I want to talk about. My last point is how do we think about a just transition? And we can think about just transition in all regions in terms of making sure that the workers and communities that are dependent on the fossil fuel industry do not face significant negative impacts. That's it. And how do we do that is the question. So let me just give some quick examples here. The one I want to talk about is West Virginia, and I was inspired to focus on West Virginia because just 2 days ago I saw this article in the Financial Times about Senator Joe Manchin. Senator Joe Manchin on shaky grounds in coal country over climate. And he, when he supported it, he said, you know, this will be good. This will be good for West Virginia. Well, as of this piece in the Financial Times a couple of days ago, the people of West Virginia don't agree with that. They say, you know, we're for coal, that's us. We need to keep defending coal. Okay, so I want to frame this issue in terms of a study that I did with coworkers at PERI on a Green New Deal for West Virginia. Okay, so this is the study, came out about 2 years ago, and I did present it to Manchin's staff as well as to the coal miners union in West Virginia. Okay, so let me just run through it quickly. It's a small version of this big global framework. It's pretty much captures the same themes. So according to our research, for West Virginia to reduce its emissions by 50% as of 2030, it will take roughly about 4% of GDP because they are, you know, the global average is 2.5%, but because they're so fossil fuel dependent, it's more, about 4%. Okay, in doing that, in investing in renewable energy and efficiency, in West Virginia, we estimated it would generate about 25,000 jobs in the state. And that's about 3% of the current state labor force. Now, what about the existing fossil fuel economy there? And as you know, this FT piece yesterday saying we need this, we're dependent on it. Well, you have to address that. So, yeah, there's 42,000 people that are dependent in their jobs in the fossil fuel industry in the state. And that's not just oil and coal, that's all the ancillary industries like utilities, like building pipelines, everything to do with it. Okay, so there's 42,000, but if we're going to do a phase out, how many people are going to face job displacement per year? And the answer is about 1,400. And so, and that takes account of, we do a demographic analysis of people who are going to voluntarily retire. So we do an estimate, I think a conservative estimate on voluntary retirements, looking at people reaching 65 and what percentage of people at 65 are going to retire, so forth. So we come out with this number. So, Joe Manchin is going to tell us, hey, there's 42,000 people here, you're going to lay them all off? Well, that's not the way to ask the question. The thing is, we're not going to get to zero in one day in West Virginia, zero emissions. We're going to phase out fossil fuels. And so by 2030, we're going to be at a 50% phase out. And then we take account of annual, how many people per year, after recognizing that some people are going to retire. And the answer is 1,400. So we can take care of it's not that hard when you've got 25,000 jobs getting created to take care of 1,400 people per year. That's the core finding. So then we kind of build around that and we say, okay, what's the just transition program for workers? And basically we say that people have to be guaranteed that they are not going to experience a significant loss in their living standard. So you can't have a program such as, if you all ever followed the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program in the United States, which is better known as burial insurance. We can't have burial insurance. Here's $5,000, go away, go find yourself another job. Here's a training program somewhere. Just that's it. So this program entails an employment guarantee, wage guarantee, and pension guarantees. And so how much would it cost to do all of those things? And that's and in addition, yes, so we do have retraining and relocation support. But what we estimated for 1,400 workers per year, it's about $42,000 per worker displaced per year. And if you do that for 1,400 workers per year, we're at about $140 million in the state, which is 0.2% of West Virginia's GDP. And I've done it for 8 other states, same thing, and that are much less dependent on the fossil fuel industry proportionally than West Virginia. And so the same just transition program is about a 10th of what we got for West Virginia. So it's minuscule. And then for the US overall, did it for the US overall, minuscule, 0.15% of GDP to guarantee jobs, pensions, wages for everyone in the industry. And that, among other things, if you don't care about them and you care about the climate, you don't want them to be, against it. And so the FT piece is saying even Joe Manchin is not acceptable in West Virginia because he doesn't recognize how much we depend on coal. So just to wrap up here, we wrote a study also for the state of California, and that one was sponsored by unions and endorsed. Same thing, same idea of the program. So 22 unions endorsed the program, including the Steelworkers Local 675, which represents oil refinery workers in California. So these are people that have good jobs. Their average pay is about $130,000. They endorse the climate green energy program as long as it includes this just transition feature. And I just want to quote from the head of the vice president of the Steelworkers, who did a piece after our paper came out in the Los Angeles Times. And here's what Norm Rogers says. Many speak of a just transition. We've never seen one. No worker or community member will ever believe that an equitable transition is possible until we see detailed, fully funded state safety net and job creation program, which is what we did. And here he writes, continuing, with a fully funded, equitable, just transition plan, meeting the immediate needs for safety net for workers and communities and offering a bold vision to restructure our economy, we can jumpstart recovery and move California's workers, communities, and the planet toward a more secure future. So to close, Green New Deal. This is a Green New Deal in my version of it, at least. And it is the way to get to planetary survival and also advance egalitarian democratic society. Thank you.
We have time for a couple questions, Caroline.
Sure.
What's the, thanks for your talk, what's the study for the West Virginia, for the state of West Virginia?
What's the
Yeah,
like?
what's the name of the study for the state of West Virginia?
It's called, well, you had the title page, Impact of the Reimagined Africa. You can see it.
Okay,
Yeah, it's on our website, PERI website. You do green transition programs for US states. Just type that into Google, you'll get all 8 of our states events. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was wondering if your thoughts about the kind of role that people like scientists in this kind of room or this kind of school can play in this work. So a lot of what you've presented so far is like detailed plans about transitions and costs. A lot of people here focus on things like health effects of various climate related phenomena. And also maybe if you can comment anything about how that can be useful.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, I listed it, and as I said, you all know way more about that than me, so I'm not gonna make stupid statements when you're the experts. But, you know, public health impacts in terms of both indoor and outdoor pollution. Yes, I'm sure there are people here that have done research. I mean, one of my colleagues at PERI, Jim Boyce, maybe some of you have come across his work. He's done research on these so-called public health co-benefits. And yeah, I think just pushing that kind of point, it's so obvious. And you know, it's more so in less developed economies, which do not at present have the levels of pollution controls that we have, and that also depend on wood burning for indoor energy consumption and kerosene. And, you know, so again, I'm sure you're way more expert than me, but the impacts of indoor pollution from using wood burning and kerosene, as opposed to having the opportunity to introduce clean energy. As it happens, in some of the other, I do stuff, you know, I actually have a tiny investment company in green energy. And one of the things that we're trying to work on now is building green energy access in rural Burundi in Africa, because I have a colleague who's from Burundi, and so we're working on that. Yeah, that, you know, that's what and most rural low-income regions, it's the energy is kerosene, diesel, and if not that, wood burning, which are all very unhealthy. So yes, these would be great research projects.
But I guess like on the side of convincing people, the people like, so you talked about politicians, you talked about unions, and in terms of like we all care about that kind of stuff here, but not everybody shares that. So
Yeah, so, I guess I wish I could tell you what is the best way to convince people. We're all researchers, so the best thing that we know how to do is do research that's true, that says things that are true, and then try to get it out to the world somehow. And there's no, I don't think there's any magic formula, but I think that's basically it. Yeah.
I was particularly struck about the benefits for geothermal. And I'm very, particularly at least from what I understand about it, is that in the community that it is proposed or has been proposed, a lot of the stuff, or a lot of the environmental issues have to do with metals exposures, right? With metals exposures, like the
It's possible.
no, for the geothermal,
Okay.
right? Because you're still having to disrupt the environment to be able to build it, right? And then I think the same argument is made for electric vehicles, that they require a lot of precious metals. And so I guess in your line of work, I know you think you focus a lot on workers, but for communities that have to live near some of these proposed facilities, like what has been like the conversation
Yeah.
discourse around there, and I asked, because I think a lot of the time, particularly for communities, or what I found is that they very much feel like they are the ones that people are like, oh, there's space there, so we're just gonna like drop this off on you, and whatever the environmental justifications are, like you can worry about that.
Yeah, no, so great point. So, I didn't get to it. But, it's not like renewables is like this panacea. There's serious issues with renewables. So the three critical ones, the big ones, are number one, the obvious that the major renewables, solar and wind, are intermittent. So yeah, how do we have energy supply that's guaranteed, which entails storage and transmission issues, and what's our base load? So that's number one. And the second one is land use. So we were talking about, for example, if we're talking about Southwest, Phoenix, Arizona, there's not going to be enough room to put solar panels and wind turbines all over the town. So you're going to have to have transmission from, say, wind farms, maybe in Navajo areas. But the third one is then, yes, we're going to need to mine it. We're going to have, there is production that goes on to generate the supply of the minerals you need. And that is very problematic. In fact, I have a dissertation student working on exactly that right now. And it's not, so, and I've been in debates with people that say, well, if you look at, we have the cobalt, and when we talk about the overall range of mineral requirements, and virtually all of them are located in the global south. And so that are we going to talk about another new form of imperialism, climate imperialism, that term is emerging? Well, I think we have to struggle around establishing the standards that it's not imperialistic, that the benefits, first of all, you have strong environmental protections for the communities. And then secondly, the revenues from these activities are captured within the communities. It's not easy to do, it's not impossible. And when this one PhD student of mine came to me with the project, and he said, I want to write my dissertation on climate imperialism. And because, when we think about, the fact that the minerals are all mainly located in the global south. Well, I said, way back when I was just out of college, and I went down to Chile when they had a socialist government in Chile. And the very first thing that the socialist government did was nationalize copper. And they were very, very proud of it. In fact, I have a poster that I got from 1973, that in English said, the copper is now ours. And so, it's politically contingent as to, yes, we're gonna mine, but how you mine, under what conditions, and who benefits, it doesn't have to be perceived, or doesn't have to be at all, something that, is exploitative. It can be, there's certainly good reasons to think it might be, but that's part of what has to be part of the political struggle. And, if we could say that there was some other way to snap our fingers and we could, stop climate change, then maybe we wouldn't do this. I know there is a solution that other people give. And I was thinking it might come up, and I didn't bring it up because I wanted to do other stuff. But maybe some of you are proponents of degrowth, right? So we don't, let's say we don't, then we just reduce energy consumption dramatically by not growing, in fact, contracting economic activity. And I respect a lot of what these people say, and I like their intentions, but I don't think it's at all realistic, personally. We can go into that if you want. But, so that's where we are. So we either think, we either don't worry about climate change, or we build an alternative energy infrastructure, and if it's going to be dependent on nuclear and carbon capture, I think that's a far worse approach than having it be dependent on high efficiency and renewable. Given the problems that we know that will exist with those. By the way, where in my own university, we have our department has a net zero building, and we have geothermal wells right there, right on campus. Yeah.
This one too, there is a need like integrated assessment model, this can.
Which one?
Any integrated assessment model that I can use to understand the plan.
Which model can matter?
Asking if there is any.
Yeah, the model that I gave you the results. Yeah, I mean, I myself have a model. Yeah, my own model. Very, very simple macro model. Anyone can understand. Anyone that can get through high school math can understand. My model basically just says, I look at the cost of building out renewable capacity. Estimates, not mine, but Energy Department, International Renewable Energy Agency, International Energy Agency, and I just apply those costs so that I project them over time, and that gives me the cost of the renewable side, and then on the efficiency side, I try to estimate really how far, if you're having a growing economy, how far you can push the ratio of energy consumption as a share of economic activity. And I just look at the literature on that. And, for example, the International Energy Agency, again, completely thoroughly mainstream source. In their own model, they're saying the global economy roughly to 2050 is going to grow at about 3% a year. That includes everybody. That includes China growing at 7 or 8, whatever. And then they say, well, what happens to energy consumption? And they're saying that in their model, they think it's realistic to think that absolute energy consumption could actually be falling while the GDP is growing by 3% a year. Not falling by a lot, but certainly not growing commensurate with GDP growth. So we're having something like whatever it is, 1/3 of 1% contraction of energy consumption as GDP grows by 3%, which that means roughly we're getting about a 4% increase in energy efficiency a year. So these investments that I'm talking about in energy efficiency are getting us that. So in my own model, I use those two things, and then we just estimate job creation off of those, because we know how much we have to spend to get the outcomes on efficiency and renewable. And then you use what's called the input-output model that gives you employment to output ratio. So if we want to put a solar panel on the roof here, the model tells me for putting up 10 solar panels, I know how many jobs are going to get created. So that's how my model works. Other models are more complex. I couldn't explain them like I just did. I think it would. I hope it was easy to understand. The other models are more complex and sometimes not very well documented, and they end up in the same place. So yeah, the International Renewable Energy Agency model that I showed you, they basically end up in the same place as my model. And they don't even show, I've asked them to give me their model to show how they got there. They give you very vague stuff. I can, mine, I know, because I did it. Is that helpful? Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think to go back to your question, about like where your public health or like more health oriented people fit in. I think I never heard that term, but climate imperialism, like we research on like pre-set policies for that. But yeah, I mean, I see your page. Yeah, right. Faculty, okay, sorry, faculty, yeah, I'm not. But yeah, I see that that's what happened. I think. But cool places that I never did to be able to spend. Or like economists and public health.
You mean what would be the way to merge?
Like helping to create, like looking at the health aspects of like imperialism, like what you were talking about, which like the negative health effects of like mineral mining and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then helping set the regulation.
Oh, that's a great, yeah, oh my God, that's great. That would be great. Because, yeah, as an example, I have the student working on it, but yeah, I don't think he has any detailed knowledge. And I don't know if there is any detailed literature that not just says, okay, these would be the negative impacts for the community, but how do we exactly avoid the negative impacts and avoid this feature of, you know, what's come to be known as climate imperialism. There you go. So who's going to write that paper? That would be excellent. Yeah, that's there you go.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, we could give Dr. Pollin another round of applause and thank you.